American-born Shalom Hammer has the unique experience of not only serving as a rabbi in the United States, but as a chaplain for the Israeli Defense Forces. But amongst his proudest accomplishments, serving Israelis who may need just a bit of extra guidance as they navigate through Israeli society. Take a look. It's the J Report. I'm Brad Pomerantz. I am glad you are with us because I want to introduce you to a new friend. His name is Shalom Hammer, Rabbi Shalom Hammer. He's a nice Jewish boy from New York, but he has lived in the land of Israel for the last 22 years. And he has really taken an interesting approach to his making Aliyah in Israel. He has really done his best to infuse a sense of Zionism in native-born Israelis as well as other Israelis who come to the land after their birth. I am so glad you're with us, Rabbi. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Let's briefly talk about how a nice boy from Brooklyn?
Muncie.
Muncie.
It's the same thing.
Same thing. Got to Israel in his, I think it was early 20s.
I was brought up in an Orthodox home in Muncie, New York. It was one of the few Jewish day schools that I was sent to by my parents that actually spoke and communicated Ivrit be'Ivrit, that's Hebrew language.
Okay.
All of our spiritual, religious studies were done in Hebrew.
Okay.
And my parents infused us with a religious Zionist education. They were very interested in us and a vested interest in understanding Israel. And
you eventually matriculated to Yeshiva University, a fine institution, and you decided to become a rabbi.
Yes, I mean, please don't hold it against me. It is something that I always wanted to do. When I studied in yeshiva, I found that there were a number of students who were younger than me. They would come and they would ask me questions, not always necessarily related to the Talmud, but about life, to communicate, to discuss, and I enjoyed it.
And so you got married, and you and your wife decided to make Aliyah.
Yes. And
you moved to Israel at the age of 24. You joined the military. And little did you know that that service would really become your life's purpose, but not in the traditional way. You didn't become this combat veteran. You took a different approach. After you became a teacher, serving, well, tell us who you served in the early years.
In the early years, I really went in basic training, very, very basic training. It was called Shlav Bet. It was like kind of like a secondary basic training kind of for losers or old men.
Right.
And I never realized that I would be more involved in Tzahal, in the Israeli Defense Forces. Tzahal, Tzva Haganah Yisrael, the Israeli Defense Forces. And sure enough, I started to get called up every year on reserve duty. I had various tasks, and I found them very inspirational. I found it a tremendous opportunity to contribute to my country, and I was very glad I was part of that.
But at the same time, you were pursuing education, and it was literally a dual track happening simultaneously. You're serving the military, but you're educating new immigrants to Israel.
Correct.
Tell us about those new students.
Correct. I was in charge in Hadera, a city that's between Netanya and Haifa, of educating newly arrived immigrants from the former Soviet Union. These were young men who really were just coming off the boat, much like myself. I sympathized with them. I empathized with them. I understand what they were experiencing. They were not subscribing necessarily to religiosity, and I was not prepared or interested to force it down their throat. And I think that they respected that, and I did, and we created a great rapport.
And it's interesting because 20 years later, let's say, you are back educating young men, maybe from a different part of the world, but still it seems like there's this theme that speaks to you, which is talking to young men and helping them realize the importance and beauty of a Zionist state in Israel. So let's talk about what you decided to do a few years back, about 6 years ago. You're back at the yeshiva, but not the one in New York City.
That's correct. I teach in Yeshiva Hesder. Yeshiva Hesder means an arrangement, and an arrangement was made.
Marriage?
To a certain extent. I mean, a rabbi who teaches his students are married to each other in a sense. And if the marriage doesn't work, it could be miserable.
Yes, it can.
But what happened was the Israeli government struck up a deal, an arrangement with the IDF, with the Israeli Defense Forces about 50 some odd years ago, whereby students would be enabled to both combine their study of Torah, religious studies, as well as service in combat forces in the IDF.
And that's a unique situation because I know it's a controversial point for many Israelis that the most religious amongst Israeli citizens are not serving. They have an exemption. But it seems like these young men have taken an approach where they want to continue their religious studies and serve their country.
Correct. And it's an unbelievable opportunity for these young men to demonstrate to, so to speak, secular Jews or Jews who choose not to be observant that you can be observant, that they're observant, and that they are serving their country as well.
Before we talk about the students, I want to talk about the school specifically, because I think it's fair to say that it is in a location in Israel that some would argue is scary. Tell us where it is and how that adds to kind of the educational element of it.
Right. Well, I don't like to use the word scary with regards to
Some would argue.
I like to use the word inspirational.
Okay.
So it's in Kiryat Gat, which is really the opening corridor of the area of the Negev, the southern region of Israel. The yeshiva institution that I'm involved in is officially under the umbrella of Sderot Yeshivot. Everyone is familiar with Sderot.
Well, if we look at a map, it's minutes from the border with Gaza.
Correct.
And we have seen many families be impacted by those rockets coming over. Now, for better or for worse, your institution's a little farther away, so not as dramatically impacted. But I am sure that does play a role in the inspiration, as you say, behind the student body. Okay, Rabbi, when we come back, I want to talk to you more about the students, what you are teaching them, about the unique program you're offering them. And I also want to talk about another element of you and what you are doing to infuse Zionism, not necessarily religious Zionism, but Zionism in those serving in the military. Okay? His name is Rabbi Shalom Hammer. My name is Brad Palmer. We'll be right back on the J Report. Welcome back to the J Report. My name is Brad Palmer. It's glad you're still with us. We are joined by Rabbi Shalom Hammer. He moved to Israel at the age of 24, became very involved in two elements of the Israeli state simultaneously, the military and education. Someone called that an oxymoron, but not so much. You really have managed to marry those two important parts of the Jewish state. The Yeshiva Hesder program that we mentioned, it's actually a 5-year program. Most military service is 3 years, am I right, for men?
That's correct.
So tell us about this 5-year program for these young men.
What happens is the students come and they're able to combine both their religious subservience, religious study, together with their service in combat forces in the IDF. And there's a tremendous infusion of ideology as a result. So they come for 18 months, they study in the yeshiva, they then serve in combat forces for another 18 months, and they then return to the yeshiva to study again, in a sense, for lack of a better term, sandwiching their service with this religiously based study.
We mentioned that early in your career you focused on bringing in young men from the former Soviet Union into Israeli life. The yeshiva tends to target a different group of men that may face challenges in Israeli society. Tell us about the young men that tend to attend the yeshiva Hesder.
We attract, specifically, we go after the lowest achieving students. These students come largely from Sephardic families, Sephardic backgrounds. Many of them come from broken homes. They haven't been given or been infused with the concept of self-security, which ultimately is the goal of every education.
Could you give us a sense, for those that don't know, the difference between the relative success of Ashkenazi or Eastern European Jews in Israel versus some of the challenges faced by the Sephardim, which tend to be from, should we call them Arab lands? Is that fair? I mean, not Mizrahi, but Arab lands, we'll say.
Yes. I mean, to this day, while obviously there's no racial discrimination that's overt and certainly no racial annotations, but nonetheless, there still is a division between the two. And they're generally speaking, in the labor force, the Ashkenazic Jews have certainly been more successful in different fields of academia. The Sephardic Jews still remain in more of the manual labor, proletarian type of work. And we're trying to change that in the yeshiva.
And what's interesting is I would have expected that those young men who finished the yeshiva after the 5-year program, that many of them would pursue a career in the clergy. But that's not necessarily the goal.
That's correct. If anything, just the opposite. I mean, I'm happy if they do. I can't obviously downplay as my role.
Yeah.
But no, just the opposite. I try to encourage them to pursue academia, lawyers, doctors, accountants, whatever it is that can help.
And you just graduated your first class, no?
That's correct.
How are they doing? How many students?
We had 10 students
Nice.
who graduated. We have 4 who are currently attending university. One studying to be an economist, and one studying to be an accountant.
Huge.
And it's a beautiful thing to
Huge.
see. It's unbelievable.
Okay, let's shift gears and talk about another portion of your professional life and spiritual life, no doubt, and that's the Harel division of the IDF, Israeli Defense Force. Tell us about that.
Well, what happened was about 3 years ago, the chief rabbi of the Israeli Defense Forces then, Rabbi Ronsky, a very dynamic and charismatic person, realized that there's a very serious problem in Israel, and that is that aside from the enemy without, which is being surrounded by its borders by insecurity, you have an enemy within, and that is that in our generation, an internet generation, it's very difficult to infuse our youth with a pioneering spirit, with an understanding of sacrifice, and of this strange word called work.
Yeah, that's a key phrase, though, a pioneering spirit, because you think about the boomers and the sooners in America from the 19th century. I mean, your boomers and sooners are literally 50, 60 years old, 65 years old. So it's a generation that's a little older.
Correct. And it's excellent that you make that distinction, because in the United States, while it's very important to have that patriotic spirit, it's not as serious connotations with regards to a country that's not threatened in terms of its borders, thank God. But in Israel, where you have insecure borders and a consistent threat to your existence, if you're not infusing that pioneering spirit in your youth and understanding of ideology of Zionism, then you're in trouble.
And again, when you say Zionism, yes, there's some religious element to it, but it's also just the general view that the Jewish people belong in Israel? Is that a fair way to say it?
100%. In fact, we are in charge when we offer these lectures that we have to avoid anything that might be interpreted as religious coercion. That's not our goal. If that becomes the goal, then it becomes a turnoff for the soldiers.
And I think many American Jews, even non-Jews in the United States, they don't realize that Israel is not filled with, 85% of folks that are going to shul every single day. It is a relatively secular nation. Is that a fair assessment?
That is correct.
And so we see that there are tensions right now, for example, between the most religious and even the semi-religious and the secular.
Right.
So how has the program been received?
On a personal level, I've had a tremendous amount of satisfaction. I mean, I've had soldiers come to me after my presentation and they have said, thank you for giving me that talk. I can now go through the week with more amount of courage and a certain amount of confidence. That's really what we're trying to do. We have an hour segment in which we're trying to infuse them with that feeling of self-worth, feeling of self-advancement. That's really what it's about.
You have served as a pulpit rabbi for a whopping grand total of 1 year in Ohio. It's a different path than many rabbis we know. As we conclude, Rabbi, talk to me about your path, which has not been to the pulpit, but to serve people in other ways.
My path is in Israel, to the Israeli people. Israel's the future. I believe that it's the future of all Judaism. And what's important to note, and very, very vital, is that we have to understand that the constant struggle of Jewish identity is alive and well in the streets of Tel Aviv, and that has to be addressed. The future of Israel will absolutely depend on instilling and restoring Jewish identity and pride within the streets of Tel Aviv, within the streets of Israel, to Israelis who really are in danger of losing that. And that's really what I'm a part of.
His name is Rabbi Shalom Hammer. If you want to learn more about his great work, you can go to his website, rabbihammer.com. My name is Brad Pomerantz. We'll be right back on the J Report. Okay, that's all for this edition of the J Report. Don't forget, you can follow me on Twitter at Brad Pomerantz. And of course, JLTV is always online at www.jltv.tv. For the entire J Report team, I'm Brad Pomerantz. Thanks for watching.